The call. Rain poured over the city like a warning no one understood. The kind of rain that made the streets look like shattered glass. The kind that came before something changed forever. Marco Valenti sat at the head of a long oak table, surrounded by men who feared him more than they feared death itself. The warehouse was quiet except for the drumming of water against the roof and the nervous breathing of a man who owed him money. This was his kingdom, built on silence, held together by fear. Marco didn't raise his voice. He never had to. When he looked at a man, that man understood his life could end with a single nod. Tonight was supposed to be simple. A meeting, a reminder, a warning. But then his phone vibrated. He almost ignored it. Almost. His hand hovered over the device, ready to dismiss it. Then he saw the name glowing on the screen. Sophia. His chest tightened before he could stop it. He hadn't heard from her in 7 months. Not since the night she walked out of his penthouse without looking back. No goodbye. No tears. No explanation that made sense. Just silence. And now this. Marco stepped away from the table. His second in command, Enzo, watched with raised eyebrows but said nothing. Marco answered. First, all he heard was chaos. Sirens wailing somewhere in the distance. Heavy, ragged breathing. A woman trying not to scream. Then her voice came through. Trembling, broken, desperate. Marco, my baby is being born right now. Please, I don't have anyone else. The words hit him like a bullet he never saw coming. Her baby. Not their baby. Her baby. For a moment, pride told him to hang up. Pain told him to walk away. She had left him. She had chosen silence over explanation, absence over truth. She had no right to call him now. But something in her voice wasn't manipulation. It was fear. Raw, primal fear. The kind a woman feels when she's completely alone and something bigger than herself is about to happen. Without another word, Marco ended the call, turned to Enzo, and said 2 words that shocked everyone in the room. Meeting's over. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Within 60 seconds, he was in the back of his black sedan, cutting through traffic like the city owed him a debt. The rain blurred the streetlights into golden streaks as his driver pushed the car faster than the law allowed. Marco stared out the window, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. He told himself he didn't care. He told himself this was just obligation. Old loyalty. The echo of something that used to matter. But deep down, in the part of himself he never showed anyone, he knew the truth. He had never stopped loving her. The man he became. Marco Valenti wasn't born a monster. He was made. Growing up in the narrow streets of the city's forgotten neighborhoods, he learned early that the world didn't reward kindness. His father was a factory worker who drank too much and said too little. His mother was a ghost who disappeared when he was 12, walked out one morning and never came back. No note, no goodbye, just an empty chair at the breakfast table and a silence that never lifted. Marco raised himself. He fought for every meal, every corner, every breath of respect. By 18, he was running with men twice his age. By 25, he had taken over 3 territories. By 30, he was the name whispered in fear across the entire city. He built an empire not because he wanted power, but because power was the only thing that couldn't leave him. People left. Power stayed. But power came with a price. The higher Marco climbed, the emptier he became. His penthouse had marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the glittering skyline. But it was silent, cold, palace with no warmth. He had women. He had loyalty. He had men who would die for him without hesitation. But he didn't have peace. He didn't have someone who looked at him and saw more than the boss, more than the fear, more than the reputation, until Sophia. She came into his life like sunlight through a crack in a wall. Sophia worked at a small bookshop in the old quarter of the city, a place Marco passed every day but never entered. One afternoon, a sudden rainstorm forced him to step inside for shelter. She was behind the counter, reading. She looked up, saw him, soaking wet, dressed in a suit that cost more than her monthly rent, and smiled. Not the smile people gave him out of fear. A real smile. "You look like you need a towel more than a book," she said. For the first time in years, Marco laughed. He came back the next day, and the next, and the one after that. Sophia didn't know who he was. Not at first. She saw a man who was quiet, intense, and surprisingly thoughtful. A man who asked her opinion on poetry and remembered her favorite author. A man who listened more than he spoke. When she finally learned the truth, when she discovered the empire behind the man, she didn't run. "I'm not afraid of you," she told him one night, her hand resting on his chest. "I see who you are underneath all of it." For 2 years, she was his home. She was the only person who made him feel like something other than a weapon. With her, he could breathe. With her, he could imagine a different life, one where he wasn't defined by violence and fear. But the world Marco had built didn't allow for softness. His enemies watched. They waited. They looked for weaknesses. And Sophia became the most dangerous weakness of all. The threats started small. A car following her home. A photograph left on Marco's desk. Sophia walking through the market, unaware she was being watched. Marco increased her security. He moved her into a safer apartment. He did everything in his power to protect her without letting her see how afraid he truly was. But Sophia wasn't a fool. She saw the fear in his eyes. She felt the tension every time she walked out the door. She understood, perhaps better than he did, that loving him meant living in danger. One night, she sat across from him at dinner, her eyes red from crying. "I can't do this anymore," she whispered. Marco's heart stopped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I love you, but I can't live like this, waiting for something terrible to happen. Watching you become harder every day." He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Sophia, I'm leaving, Marco. Please don't follow me." She walked out that night, and Marco let her go, because part of him believed she was right. Part of him believed she deserved better than a life spent looking over her shoulder. He told himself it was the right choice. He told himself he would survive. But the truth was, the night Sophia left was the night something inside Marco died. He became colder, harder, more ruthless than ever before. The man who once read poetry in a bookshop disappeared. Only the boss remained. The hospital. The hospital was small, old, and on the edge of town, far from the gleaming towers of the city center. Marco's car pulled up to the entrance, and he was out before the vehicle fully stopped. Rain soaked his coat as he walked through the automatic doors, his presence commanding immediate attention. A nurse looked up from her desk, startled. "Sophia Reyes," Marco said. "She called me. She's in labor." The nurse hesitated, clearly unsure whether to be helpful or terrified. "Down the hall. She's..." Marco didn't wait for the rest. He found her in a hallway near the delivery wing. She was sitting in a wheelchair, alone, pale as paper, her body shaking with contractions. Her hair was damp from the rain. Her eyes were closed in pain. No family around her. No partner. No ring on her finger. She opened her eyes and saw him standing there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sophia's face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "You came," she whispered. "Of course I came." He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He picked her up from the wheelchair himself and carried her into the delivery room. The next several hours passed like years. Marco sat in the waiting area outside the delivery room, his hands clenched, his jaw tight. He had faced down armed men without flinching. He had negotiated with killers and walked through war zones without a tremor in his voice. But tonight, sitting in that plastic chair, listening to the muffled sounds from behind the closed door, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear. Not for himself. For her. He didn't know why he stayed. Maybe it was loyalty. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was love he had never fully buried, no matter how hard he tried. All he knew was that he couldn't leave. Then the cry came. Sharp. New. Alive. The sound cut through the silence like a blade made of hope. Marco stood up, his heart pounding. A nurse stepped out with a soft smile on her face. She looked at him with warmth, as if he belonged there. "Congratulations," she said. Marco frowned. "Congratulations for what?" She didn't answer with words. Instead, she stepped forward and placed a small bundle into his arms. The baby was wrapped in a pale blue blanket. Tiny. Perfect. Silent now after that first cry. Marco looked down. The child opened his eyes. And the world stopped. Same eyes. The same dark, intense gaze that Marco saw in the mirror every morning. The same shape. The same depth. The same unmistakable fire. His breath caught in his throat. Suddenly everything made sense. The timeline. The silence. The sudden breakup that had come out of nowhere. She didn't leave because she stopped loving him. She left because she was protecting something. Protecting someone. Marco held the baby against his chest and walked slowly into Sophia's room. She was lying in the hospital bed, exhausted but calm. Her eyes were red from crying, but when she saw him holding their son, a sad smile crossed her face. "I wanted to tell you," she whispered, "so many times. Why didn't you? Because of who you are. Because of what your world would do to him." Marco sat down beside her bed, the baby still in his arms. "I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks before I left," Sophia continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew if your enemies ever found out, if they knew you had a son." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Marco understood. In his world, children were leverage, weakness, targets. If anyone knew he had a son, that child would never be safe. Every rival, every enemy, every man with a grudge would have a weapon to use against him. Sophia had walked away not because she didn't love him. She walked away because she loved the child more than she loved herself. More than she loved him. Marco looked down at the baby in his arms. His son. His blood. "What's his name?" he asked. "I wanted to ask you," Sophia said quietly. "I thought maybe Matteo, after your father." Marco's breath caught. His father had been a broken man, but he had loved Marco in the only way he knew how. Quietly, imperfectly, but truly. "Matteo," Marco repeated. The name felt like a promise. The choice. The next 3 days were the most peaceful of Marco's life. He stayed at the hospital, sleeping in the chair beside Sophia's bed. He held Matteo for hours at a time, watching his son breathe, counting his tiny fingers, memorizing every detail of his face. For 3 days, the empire didn't exist. For 3 days, Marco Valenti was just a man holding his child. But the world outside didn't stop. On the 4th day, Enzo arrived at the hospital with news that turned Marco's blood cold. "Word got out," Enzo said quietly, his face grim. Someone saw you here. Someone talked. Marco's hands tightened into fists. Who knows? Everyone. By tomorrow, every rival family in the city will know you have a son. The walls closed in. Marco looked through the window at Sofia holding Matteo, singing softly to him. Everything he had feared was happening. His enemies now had the ultimate weapon against him. That night, Marco sat in the hospital room long after Sofia and the baby had fallen asleep. He watched them in the dim light, the woman he loved and the child he never knew he had, and he realized the truth. If he stayed in their lives, they would never be safe. Every day would be a risk. Every moment would be shadowed by fear. Matteo would grow up with bodyguards and bulletproof glass. He would learn to look over his shoulder before he learned to ride a bike. That wasn't a life. That was a prison. Marco had two choices. He could keep his empire and lose his family, or he could give up everything and keep them safe. For a man who had spent his entire life building power, the choice should have been impossible. But sitting there, watching his son sleep, Marco realized something. Power had never made him happy. Only love had done that. The next morning, Marco called a meeting, not with his enemies, with his own men. He stood before them, Enzo, his captains, the inner circle that had followed him for years. "I'm stepping down," he said. The room went silent. "I'm leaving the city. Tonight. I'm taking Sofia and my son, and I'm disappearing." Enzo stepped forward, shock written across his face. "Boss, you can't." "I can. And I am." Marco looked around the room at the men who had given him loyalty, violence, and years of service. "You can fight over what I'm leaving behind, or you can burn it to the ground. I don't care anymore." He turned to leave. "Why?" Enzo called after him. Marco stopped at the door. He thought about all the years he had spent chasing power, the enemies he had crushed, the blood on his hands that would never wash away. And then he thought about Matteo's eyes opening for the first time. "Because some things matter more than being feared," he said. The road. They left at midnight. No convoy. No guards. Just one car, one woman, one man, and one sleeping baby. Marco drove through the rain, the city lights fading in the rearview mirror. Sofia sat beside him, Matteo wrapped safely in her arms. For miles, neither of them spoke. Then Sofia reached over and placed her hand on his. "Are you sure about this?" she asked. Marco glanced at her, then at the baby. "I've never been more sure of anything." They settled in a small town 300 miles from the city. Quiet place. Unremarkable. The kind of town where no one asked questions and everyone minded their own business. Marco bought a small house on the edge of the woods. He got a job at a local garage, fixing cars with his hands instead of breaking bones. Sofia opened a small online bookshop from home. And Matteo grew. He learned to walk on the worn wooden floors of their living room. He said his first word, "Papa," on a Sunday morning while Marco was making breakfast. Every milestone was a miracle. Every ordinary day was a gift. There were hard nights. Nights when Marco woke up in a cold sweat, haunted by the things he had done. Nights when he wondered if he deserved this peace. But Sofia was always there. She would hold him in the darkness and whisper the truth he needed to hear. "The past doesn't own you anymore. What matters is what you choose now." And every day Marco chose them. He chose Matteo's laughter over fear. He chose Sofia's love over power. He chose redemption over revenge. The final scene. 5 years later, Marco stood in the backyard of their small house, watching Matteo chase fireflies in the summer dusk. The boy was beautiful. Dark hair, bright eyes, a smile that could light up the darkest room. Sophia walked up beside Marco and wrapped her arm around his waist. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. Marco watched his son laughing, cupping his hands around a flickering light. "No," he said, and for the first time in his life he meant it completely. The empire was gone. The power was gone. The name that once made men tremble was fading into history. But he had something better. He had a family. He had love. He had a second chance he never deserved but chose to honor every single day. That night, after Matteo fell asleep, Marco sat beside his son's bed and watched him breathe. He thought about the night of the phone call, the rain, the hospital, the moment he looked into his son's eyes for the first time and felt his entire world shift. He thought about the choice he made, and he realized the truth. He didn't save Sophia that night. She saved him. Matteo saved him. Love saved him. Marco leaned down and kissed his son's forehead. "I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of you," he whispered. Then he stood up, walked to the window and looked out at the stars. For the first time in his existence, Marco Valenti wasn't running from anything. He wasn't chasing anything. He was simply home. Some men are remembered for the power they held. Others are remembered for the love they chose. Marco Valenti chose love. And that made all the difference.